Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Welcome, everyone, to Sports Spectrum. As always, we are sponsored by Compassion International. And today's podcast is a unique opportunity to learn about the man who is in charge of Compassion International. We've told you about what they do and the work that they're doing to release children from poverty. But today we get a chance to learn the journey, the story of Jimmy Mellado, who is the president and CEO of Compassion International. And yes, we talk about compassion because it's really amazing the work that they're doing, helping to release children from poverty, the real work that they're doing in the trenches in these countries. But Jimmy's story is just awesome. I mean, Jimmy is a guy who said his parents moved, and you'll hear the full story in the podcast here, but he said his parents moved 41 times in 61 years of marriage. 41 times. And Jimmy was raised in 7 different countries himself after being born in El Salvador. Jimmy was a graduate of SMU, and he was a member of the 1983 Division I track and field championship team with SMU, and then competed in the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul, South Korea, as a decathlete, representing his birth nation of El Salvador. In 2013, he was named CEO and president of Compassion. And Jimmy's story, like I said, is a powerful one, and he's a really good storyteller, which makes for a perfect podcast. And so take a listen to the journey and the powerful story of Jimmy Mellado, president and CEO of Compassion International, here on Sports Spectrum. Jimmy, welcome to the show.
Awesome to be with you, Jason. Total pleasure. Love the connection we've had over this last year.
Yes, very excited. And first off, again, thank you for being partners with us here at Sports Spectrum. We've been sharing about the great work being done with Compassion and, you know, for the last year or so. And we really want to thank you for coming alongside with us and helping reach people for Christ.
Well, we love what you guys are doing. It really is transforming lives, marriages, families, and believe in what you guys are doing so deeply. Grateful for that.
That's great. I appreciate that. Now let's learn a little bit about your story, because your journey is quite the fascinating one. I first heard it at one of our conferences a year or so ago, and just blown away by some of the things that you've got to experience and kind of your upbringing. I know you were born in El Salvador, but raised in 7 different countries. Tell me what that childhood is like. That sounds like a fascinating childhood.
Well, I probably have to start with my mom, who was born into poverty, knows what it's like to keep a dirt floor clean, daughter of immigrant farmers that lived on the Mexico-U.S. border, grew up, completely in a Mexican context back in 1934. And but she was a real adventuresome young lady. And then later on married another young man. They both came, to Christ. And then they set out to just explore the world. In their 61 years of marriage, they've moved 41 times.
Oh, my gosh.
So we were like nomads, I think. Before I celebrated my first birthday, I'd already been to 6 countries. As you mentioned, I was raised in 8 different schools before graduating high school, 26 different homes. So we moved around a lot, mostly in the developing world. And my dad was an engineer. He was building roads and dams and powerhouses, transmission lines, water systems. I remember moving to Santa Cruz, Bolivia, and they didn't have electricity 24/7. And that was my dad's job, was in fact to provide electricity there. So I remember what it was like to go through major portions of the day with no electricity, and that just being normal. As you mentioned, I was born in El Salvador, in the middle of a jungle where my dad was building. He was building a powerhouse and dam there, and was born there with no doctor's support, just natural birth. But it was quite the adventure. And I will say this, that usually when you move around that much, it's not good for kids. But my life was really stable. Actually, I actually thought it was normal that every family moved every year, and just later on discovered, it's not quite normal. But it was stable for me because of my parents' faith in Jesus. My family was my first small group. My family was my first church. We would do little church services, just our family alone, as we would move in between countries and go from one church to another. There were always gaps in that experience. So we did church just as our family. And so I look back on it now, and it was just a rich time of being exposed to different cultures, being exposed to the needs of the world, particularly the poor, which actually has become central to my life calling because of it, I think.
Yeah, I wonder for you, too, because you said as you look back. So when you're going through it, are you appreciative of what you're going through? Do you even have a sense that there's others that are, quote unquote, from a worldly perspective, better off? How is that view when you were going through this process as a toddler, as a young boy, and then even into your teen years?
Well, since I didn't know any other experience, I thought that was normal, and I enjoyed experiencing the different cultures. Now, every time my dad would come home and say, "Hey, we're going to move to this country," of course, we would all complain and say, "Oh, we're not going to find friends like that, or a church like that, and school like that. Why do we have to move so much?" So there was that for sure. But then my dad would say, "Well, wait till we get to the new place. You're going to find new friends, and the Church of Jesus is everywhere, and our hearts will get tied to a new group of people, and you'll have a growing pool of friends." And I'll never forget my dad's 80th birthday. We invited friends that they had made throughout the years, and so many of them came, and it felt a bit like the United Nations. The diversity that was in that birthday party was really beautiful. And again, Now, some of my other siblings, I think they struggled with it a little bit more, but I really enjoyed it. Now, there were some things that I had to deal with. I think some of my achievement orientation, some of it was greatly fueled by good stuff, but there was some other parts of it that maybe were fueled more by an achievement orientation of wanting to be accepted in the new place, because I was always a new kid.
Yeah.
And the way to get accepted was to achieve or to perform or to do well so that you'd be embraced and liked by the new set of kids. So that led to, I think, some people pleasing in my life that I had to process through and not be driven by that, but be driven by, Christ in me and not what other people think. So that was probably the worst downside of it. Of moving so much. But again, on the whole, it was really an amazing experience that God used to even mold me into who I am today and into the work I do today.
You participated in the 1988 Summer Olympics, and we're going to talk about that time in a second. But obviously, there's an athlete in you there, a big-time athlete in you. When did that start to take shape as well? Because you're moving from place to place, so I can try to imagine how sports was a part of your life as you continued to move to many different countries.
Yeah, and it was the common denominator as I'd move from one place to another. Soccer was mainly the deal. Everything was about soccer in most of the countries where I grew up. And my family background, dad and mom, they really had no sports background. But what did it for me was 1972. We were in Nicaragua, and that summer, as a little kid in elementary school, third grade, if I recall, between third and fourth grade, I saw and was watching the Summer Olympics from Munich, and everything that happened there. Of course, the tragedy of the 11 Israeli athletes and coaches that were killed in that process. The whole concept of the Olympic Games as a third grader just mesmerized me. And soon after that, I started organizing on a regular basis little competitions in recess at school. I remember starting, high jump competitions. We didn't have mats. We didn't have crossbars. So we'd use just a tree limb was our crossbar. And we'd do high jump stuff and long jump and hurdles and just try to, as best we could, have little competitions. That's where it started for me. I just was sold and mesmerized by the Olympic movement in third grade.
And I think about when I'm looking at your resume, and it says you participated in the 1987 Pan Am Games and then the 88 Olympics. So that's 13, 14, 15, 16 years later that you get to sort of achieve this dream that you were putting together as a third grader. So walk us through the process of how you become an Olympian. How does that work for you?
Well, it starts with that kind of passion and dream and aspiration. That could come from anything almost. For me, it was watching the Olympics. Could have been, for others, it's meeting an athlete or a sibling doing something. Who knows what it is? But it starts with the dream and your heart getting seized by that, and a passion and a desire to want to move toward toward whatever that dream is. And so I was a little guy. I was always shorter than other people. But man, did I have a desire to want to achieve. And, by the time I was in sixth grade, I was able to jump over my head. And we would, again, in these little pickup competitions during recess, I remember for our crossbars, we had this tree limb, but then we found a stick that would, go across about 6-7 feet. We had trash cans with baseball bases that we would put underneath the bar as the bar got higher and higher and higher. And so just seized by a passion and a vision and a dream for something. That's where it started. And then just being and just getting involved and doing it and having fun with it. That's where it started. And for me, I remember Bruce Jenner. I think he placed ninth in the 72 games in the Olympic Games back then. And I loved all of the events. Yeah. I mean, I loved them all. And that's what eventually led me to do the decathlon. And again, it's a little counterintuitive because I'm 5'8" and 160 pounds. So I was giving up at least 4 inches and 30 pounds to the average decathlete. But for me, that didn't matter. I loved it. And out of that love and passion grew a sense of commitment and training. And training wasn't work for me. Training was recreational for me, and I couldn't get enough of it. And was just curious to learn that next event, whether it was the disc or the shot or the javelin or the pole vault or whatever. I just loved it all. Loved track and field and the whole where it came from and the Greek games and the original Olympiads and all of that. I mean, I bought the whole thing from the beginning.
So take me through the moment where you realized you are an Olympian and now you get to participate in Seoul, South Korea in 1988 and be a summer Olympian and go out there and represent your country. Well, that's an interesting sort of twist to this too, because you had a lot of countries that you probably could have represented having traveled through so many places. So take us to the moment and then certainly why El Salvador was the place that you chose to represent.
Well, I'll tell you, I was born in El Salvador, so I'm a dual citizen, and then became an American citizen. So I have both. Okay. I could have competed for both. And just so you know, and this is a significant part of my story and what even led me to Compassion eventually. When I was a kid growing up in all these developing countries, during summers or times, we would come visit the United States. And the United States looked like the perfect country to me. Right. I mean, they had everything, and they would take us to places like Disneyland or San Diego Zoo, and then they'd take us to these amazing things called malls, which I had no idea. In the developing world, they didn't have malls. And they'd take us to these malls, and they had everything you could ever imagine or want. And then we'd come back home to where we didn't have any of that stuff. Right. And so I wanted to leave that world and be in the United States and be successful in the United States, where I thought it mattered to be successful as a kid. And so I didn't like, that I was born in Latin America. Every time, first day of school, this is one part I tended to dread as a kid. First day of school, they go through the roll call, and they'd get to the middle of the alphabet, and there'd be a pause. And I knew why there was a pause, because the teacher was trying to figure out, how do you pronounce Santiago Heriberto Mellado? And I'd say, yeah, just call me Jimmy. That's good. I didn't even want her to say that name. I wanted to be known as Jimmy. I wanted to be seen as an American. So I wanted to compete for the United States, and everything was going as planned. By the time I graduated high school, I was comparable to Bruce Jenner in 5 of the 10 events. SMU, which was the number 2 track team in the country, recruited me and decided to go there. And we had some amazing people on that team. In 1983, we won the NCAA Division I title in track, indoor and outdoor. Mike Carter, who was the all-time, still holds the world record for juniors in the shot put over 80 feet. Played nose guard for San Francisco 49ers, Super Bowl champ, silver medal in the 84 Olympics. We had a couple world record holders on the team, Keith Connor, triple jump. So it was an amazing team, and I got to learn all the other events that I wasn't as good at on that team. So everything was in place, set the school record, and I wanted to see if I could qualify for 84 Olympics and 88, but for the United States, for reasons I mentioned earlier. I didn't want to represent El Salvador. So everything was going as planned, and I was redshirted 1 year to learn most of the rest of the events. And in my first, in my junior year, which was my junior athletic year, but my senior year academically, I was in the first meet in decathlon in University of Houston. And as I took off in the long jump, the tendon behind my knee popped. I'd never been hurt like that before. I flew through the air some 20-some feet, grabbed my hurt leg midair, and landed on one leg, my right good leg, and twisted that knee with all the weight coming on that one leg. And in an instant, I thought, I'm done. I mean, it's over. And a few weeks later, I tried to come back too soon to try to make the national meet, tore it again. I would end up tearing that tendon 4 times in a 2-month period, trying to desperately come back. So the coach calls me into his office. This was after the second time the tendon tore. And he said, Jimmy, I know your faith in Christ. You've affected me. You've affected other athletes on the team. And I know that I've got a decision in my future to decide what am I going to do about faith. So I appreciate that. And I see your commitment to your God. And in light of that, I just have one question for you. With that kind of commitment to your God, how could he let this happen to you?
Yeah.
And, I'm 21 years old at the time, confused. It had always been follow God and he blesses you. And that was the pattern. And I thought, follow God and he even blesses you with human, earthly results,
right,
victories, those kinds of things. I hadn't yet been through a major desert. I was about to. So he says, I understand that the trainers tell me you're probably always going to have a weak spot there. And, we always compete for the national title. And you're graduating with your engineering degree. I was set to go to business school at SMU the next year. And he said, I can't do that. I can't cover that. Can't do the scholarship for graduate school. So, he took my scholarship away for the 5th year. And I was devastated, just devastated. Felt like I got fired. I went up to the top of the football stadium and just bawled my eyes out. And then I got this crazy idea because I was asking God the same question, why? And I remember telling that coach, I don't know, coach. All I know is a faith isn't a faith if you only have it in good times. And I'll agree with you. These are not good times. But my faith is my faith. So I went up to the stadium and prayed and said, God, why? And then this idea came into my mind. Oh, I see what you're doing. You're going to heal me, and the coach is going to come to Christ. I'll give you all the glory. It'll be a testimony to the other team members on how you healed me and made it to the national meet, and we won the title again. And, oh, I see. This is awesome. So I prayed a prayer in faith. Lord, heal my tendon. Heal it. And in faith, I thought, all right, he's healed it. So I ran down on the football field, and I took off running just to confirm that it had been healed. And that was the 3rd time that it popped and tore. And I remember falling down on that field, and God was dealing with me in a different way. And I was learning more lessons through failure than through victory, as is always the case, I found in my life anyway. So, and then I tore it one more time a few weeks later, again, still trying to make it work. So I quietly closed my career at that time. This is 1985, and I thought I was done. And then in 1987, through a happenstance meeting between my dad, who still had work in Latin America, sat on a plane next to the president of the Track Federation of El Salvador. And they started talking. He said, my son used to do the decathlon. These were his marks. And he said, are you kidding? That'd be way more than our national record. Why didn't he compete for us? He said, well, he never really thought about that. So in 1987, out of the blue, I get a letter from the Track Federation of El Salvador asking if I'd represent them in 87 in the Pan Am Games. And, I was as low as could be at that time, done, didn't think, no one was interested in me at that time for sure. So I said, okay. So in 87, I went to the Pan Am Games. I was working a full-time job, training at night, and in the 8th event, tore my leg again.
Wow.
But it was after I'd competed and got some heights in the pole vault. So all I had left was the javelin and the 1500 to get through that to try to maintain my 4th spot. And wrapped up the leg, got through the javelin, got through the 1500, and got, maintained my 4th spot there in the Pan Am Games, missed the medal by 1. And then that's when they said, well, if you're interested, can't make you any promises. We're in the middle of a civil war, and we only have enough money for 6 spots in the 88 Olympic Games. Only 6 spots, all sports, biking, boxing, cycling, whatever. We only have 6 spots. So even if you're the best in your sport, doesn't mean you'll go. And even if you qualify, doesn't mean you'll go. But we'd like to invite you to try. So I took a leave of absence from work, went down to El Salvador and trained. They were in the middle of a civil war. It was awful. And on a asphalt track with the worst kinds of facility you could imagine, I was able to just qualify. And then it was at that point holding my breath to see if I'd be picked to be one of the 6 slots, and was. And then went and had the Olympic Games in 88 in Seoul. And out of the 42 that signed up, I placed 26th. But I was healthy beginning to end. And I've only done, because of injury, I've only done 4 healthy decathlons in my life. And that was, for me, scoring at a level that the coaches thought I should have scored in college. And by the way, I actually went back to SMU and asked the coaches there to train me. Could I come back and train there? And my coaches in college said yes. So I went back down to Dallas and I trained with them, going back and forth from there in El Salvador. So it was, for me, a way back into a life that I wanted to leave. And I'll never forget the president of the Olympic Committee. The last thing he said before I left El Salvador after the Olympic Games, he looked at me and he said, so many of our high potential young people, they leave. They go to Europe, they go to the United States, and they never come back. And they looked at me and he said, please don't forget us. Please come back.
Wow.
And I got to tell you, Jason, I think I did. I think I did forget them for a couple decades. Again, I had a lot of growing up to do. And I remember sitting in a meeting. This was a few years before I came to Compassion. And I'm sitting in a room with executives on our executive team, and the leader was bemoaning the fact that we didn't have enough diversity in the organization. And so we don't have diversity here, we don't have diversity in our staff ranks, don't have diversity in our volunteers. And then he said, and we don't have diversity on our executive team. And I'm sitting in the circle. And I thought, wow, do they know?
Right.
So I slowly raised my hand and I said, now, just making sure, you guys do know I'm Hispanic and that my real name is Santiago Heriberto Mellado. And everybody kind of laughed, but the person next to me said something that they didn't intend to hurt me. They didn't. To this day, this person, we have an amazing relationship, but this person leaned over with their arm and pointed to me and said, oh, but you don't count.
Wow.
And 2 thoughts hit me. The first one was, well, I finally made it. I'm finally American. I'm finally not seen as Hispanic. I'm Jimmy. I'm not Santiago. And the second thought was the one that would impact me more deeply. And that was, I take it as of the Lord because of its impact in my life since then. And it was, and that's not you. What are you running away from? And why don't you like how I created you, your name, where I had you be born? What are you running away from? And that was the one that I ricocheted in my soul a lot and started to bring me back home to where I came from, who I was born, and loving that, not trying to hide that. And
wow.
So that then brought me back to El Salvador and wanting to serve El Salvador, but also other countries that are in impoverished situations around the world. And eventually that was the starting point that led me to Compassion 6 years ago, of wanting to give my life and to really leverage the fact that I grew up in the developing world. The last 20-some years in the United States, 25-some years in the United States, serving in the well-resourced world, particularly the well-resourced church, and now here at Compassion, being called to lead the building of a bigger bridge between the under and the well-resourced world. And it's hard for me to, believe how the Lord brought me full circle all the way back around. And at the inauguration, when I just came into presidency here 6 years ago, my 84-year-old mom was able to be there. And afterwards, she came up to me, still a tiny lady, 5'3", stood there staring at me, didn't say a word. And I said, Mom, you okay? What's up? She didn't say anything, hugged me, pulled back, trying to get a word out, couldn't talk. Hugged me again 3 times. She hugged and pulled back, trying to talk, and couldn't. Then finally, quickly, in a final hug, said, Hablemos más tarde, which means we'll talk later. So the next day I came up to her and I said, Mom, what was going on there in that moment after the ceremony? And she said, when someone is born into poverty, they never think it's going to be a benefit to their children. That's something you want to release your children from.
Right.
Raise them out of that. And yet I could see me growing up in poverty imparted a certain DNA in the life of my son that's become central to his calling. And I just was overwhelmed with gratitude at the journey that Jesus brought me on of taking what was hard and making it into good. Not only my life, but my kid's life. And I just wanted to express it and just couldn't.
Wow. I love that. Jimmy Mellado is our guest here on Sports Spectrum. Let's just turn the page. I know there's a lot that happens in your life for, a while there, but for time purposes, let's go to when you start working with Compassion. And I love that story with your mom there and kind of full circle for yourself, releasing children from poverty. We talk about that. I mention that. It feels like every episode, and I never get tired of saying it because of the powerful effect that it really does have when someone decides to sponsor a child. Can you take us through maybe inside the work being done and what you've seen with your own eyes and just coming to become the president and CEO of Compassion and the great work they're doing?
Well, it is a beautiful work. I'm honored to be able to be the servant of now 7,500 churches led by indigenous leaders in some of the poorest, toughest communities in the world. We serve in 25 countries, and as you said, our mission is to release children from poverty in Jesus' name. And that child, actually, we start when it's prenatal, in the womb. We can start as early as that, all the way up to 22, post-graduating from college or vocational school or whatever. So it's that whole spectrum. And we only do our ministry in partnership with a local church. Our strategy is the full gospel of Jesus Christ, the full gospel that we believe is the most effective strategy to release anyone from any kind of poverty in Jesus' name. And we're particularly called to serve children living in extreme poverty situations, but to partner with churches. And like I said, we partner with 7,500 churches, growing at 1.5 churches a day. Yeah. And then those churches are, in a real tangible way, the hands and feet of Jesus to the children, to the families that are within walking distance of that church in these communities. And it's a beautiful thing. I've had an opportunity to visit now 28 of our 35 countries, and to see these heroes on the front lines of fighting back the effects of poverty that rob children and families of hope and thoughts of a better future, and provide them a relationship with Jesus Christ, as we also meet the physical and the emotional and the cognitive needs of the children. So it's the full holistic gospel that is the core of our strategy as we love on these children.
One of the great things that we've seen, I've been to different places, including conferences that our parent company, Pro Athletes Outreach, puts on, where they have this sort of virtual reality experience with compassion. And I'll put on these glasses, these virtual reality goggles, however you want to call them, and suddenly I'm transformed into this country to see the work being done. Can you explain a little bit where, for example, somebody's listening and might be saying, I want to get involved? And I can tell you, just personally myself, we sponsor a 13-year-old boy from Haiti. We pay $38 a month, but we know where that's going. And I think when I went through that virtual reality experience, it really showed me that this is the best $38 I spend every month, because I see where this money is going. Can you take me through sort of where exactly the sponsorships entails and helping these kids be released from poverty?
No, that's great. And I join you there, Jason. We've been sponsoring children, our family, for long before I came to Compassion, and was able to visit the field and our children before I came to Compassion. So I was very familiar with the ministry when I came. But to be able to go to that church and have a file and go to the bookshelf or the filing cabinet and see the binders, one per child, and be able to open up that binder and see where that $38 goes to provide for that vaccination, or providing for the meals, or providing for the education fees, or even shoes or school uniforms, or it can be anything that's preventing that child from reaching their full God-given potential, is what that $38 could go to alleviate, to support, to move that child along. And it's amazing in these settings what can be done with so little of resources, because they're living on less than $1.90 a day, many of them. Some of them, $3 a day, it varies, but all in these very, very poor situations. So to be able to go to that church and see the tutors, and we have about 100,000 workers in these 7,500 churches, about 15 or so workers per church, and they serve about 250 children on average per church, of children that are within walking distance of that church, and they get them together in the church, and they spend on average in the duration of a sponsorship about 4,000 hours of direct contact with these children during their most at-risk years of their life in a local church. And often, as you could imagine, if the children are being served during the week, where does the family go to church on the weekends? Yeah. Well, they end up going to that church. So it's an amazing, we're not necessarily doing it for church growth reasons, but because of the way we do it, it often results in incredible church growth in terms of that church's impact on the greater community, not just the children.
I love that. And I know how Compassion has really affected a lot of professional athletes as well, and they're getting involvement. Certainly Nate Solder, who was on this podcast a few months ago, the New York Giants offensive lineman, Super Bowl champion with the Patriots, he went on a trip with Compassion and his wife and talked about on the show what that difference made in his life. What's that been like for you to see a guy like Nate and others really buy into what Compassion is all about and be involved and make a difference?
Well, it's inspiring. I mean, it's inspiring to sit down and talk to Nate and Lexi and see how their situation with their child, very, very serious health challenges there with one of their children.
Yeah.
And then they saw how other children were living around the world. And they said, you know what, had our child been in that setting, our child probably wouldn't have even survived. And it's only because we have the resources to come around our child that our child is able to get the care and the love and the medical attention needed to help him, have a long and thriving life. And so their heart was seized with compassion and empathy for the children living in a very difficult situation. So they have made it possible for over 1,600 children to receive the loving care of a church through sponsorship. They have launched 4 different child development centers. They've also launched 4 different child survival programs, which is our prenatal program that I talked about earlier, of serving these pregnant moms and their children all the way through 1 year of age. And then at that point, they can join the sponsorship program in that local church. It's home-based initially, and then at 4 years old, it becomes church-based. And then that church walks with them and walks with that family. And Nate and Lexi have made that happen, and the lives of 1,600 children, because of their commitment, are going to be changed forever. So inspired is really the one word that comes to mind when I think about Nate and Lexi and what they're doing. They're living beyond themselves. They're living as Jesus would, giving themselves to those, the oppressed, the marginalized, the poor, children in poverty. So they're a beautiful couple.
I love that. Jimmy, this has been great. As our time winds down, first of all, I want to mention the website. It's compassion.com/sports spectrum for those listening to the podcast. A real chance to make a difference here. You can check out the website and learn more information about how you can get involved and sponsor a child and release them from poverty. Compassion.com/sports spectrum. Jimmy, last question. We ask this question to all of our guests here on the show. I'm curious to know what the Lord's doing in your life right now. What are you learning from God today in the season of life where he has you right now?
Taking full ownership of building a soul-satisfying existence as I meet the demands of leadership at Compassion, demands of being a dad and a husband, and being able to create a place where my soul is thriving, that I never put the cause, even the cause of compassion, which is so precious, to put that in the driver's seat of my life, that only Jesus is trustworthy enough for me to place the development and growth of my life. Only he can handle leading that. And so I never put the cause in front of way of life in Christ. But at times it's tempting, when you got pressures and stuff you got to do and a lot of demands on your life that seem to escalate every year, expectations of others on you, to just keep that place of centeredness in my heart that no, who I'm becoming in Christ is in fact the most important contribution I can make to compassion in the kingdom. It's not what I do, it's who I'm becoming. And if I'm becoming the person Jesus wants me to become, then what I do will be a natural fruit of that kind of life, but not the other way around. So that, for me, Jason, is like a constant reminder. Who I'm becoming in Christ is the most significant contribution I can make. And then let what I do for Christ flow out of that. But don't get the order wrong. So I need to remind myself every day of that challenge as I kind of face the demands that come my way.
I love it. He is Jimmy Mellado, President and CEO of Compassion International, 1988 Summer Olympian representing El Salvador. Jimmy, this has been great. Thank you so much for sharing your story, your journey, your heart for Jesus, and your heart to help others, and to just really appreciate the work that you're doing. And again, appreciate your partnership here with Sports Spectrum. All the best to you, and hopefully we'll do it again soon.
Would love that, Jason. And we as well love our partnership with Sports Spectrum, and blessings on you and the incredible ministry that's happening there.
And many thanks to Jimmy Mellado, the President and CEO of Compassion International, for joining us here on Sports Spectrum's podcast. Great storyteller. And man, what a powerful story of learning lessons through failure and the torn tendon injuries that he suffered and trusting God when things don't go well. Just the idea of him as a kid growing up and moving all over the world and in and out of different countries and coming to the U.S. and then going back home, and just lessons and appreciation for what he had and a connection to God through it all, and trusting in God in all that he's done, and now doing amazing work with Compassion. And I don't have to tell you about how awesome it is to have Compassion be sponsors of this Sports Spectrum podcast, to be partners with us. And we love them. We really do. And I hope after hearing Jimmy's story and Jimmy's heart that you might consider sponsoring a child through Compassion for $38 a month. Again, the website is compassion.com/sportsspectrum. Compassion.com/sportsspectrum. All the information is there. An opportunity for you to release a child from poverty awaits you. Check out the website to learn more. I promise you it's the best money you will spend every single month, knowing that it's going to help release a child from poverty and providing them with food and education and medical care and vocational training. And as you heard Jimmy talk about, it's all done to bring kids closer to Jesus Christ through the local church. Compassion.com/sportsspectrum. That's the website. Check it out and sponsor a child today. Many thanks to Jimmy Mellado, and thanks to you for listening to this episode of the podcast. You can reach us via social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at sports_spectrum. And please consider emailing me directly, jason@sportsspectrum.com. jason@sportsspectrum.com. Any guest ideas you have, any feedback you want to provide, any thoughts about Compassion or Jimmy and his story, please send it to me directly. I would love to hear from you. jason@sportsspectrum.com. Also want to encourage you to check out our website, sportsspectrum.com. It's a great website with content every single day on the intersection of sports and faith. Definitely bookmark that website. You don't want to miss the content that's being put out each and every day, including a daily devotional at 6 a.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday, to start your day right in the Lord. Check it out, sportsspectrum.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Brand new episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast coming your way. Have a great rest of your day.